Disorder! Disorder! Disorder!
Welcome back, Doug Pagitt Radio, with our guest, Bruce Epperly, who's the author of a book called Process Theology, A Guide for the Perplexed. And Bruce has written a book where he has tried to introduce, in this book, an explanation for people who don't understand how the world is ordered, why it is the way that it is. There's people who want the world to make sense with their view of God, and they want their view of God to make sense with their world. And so often these two things seem to collide with one another. That there's these teachings that we have that seem to not fit basic assumptions about the world. And Bruce takes that seriously and wants to have a conversation about that. So, Bruce, thanks for being thanks again for being on the show.
It's a joy.
You know, I'm reminded of this scene from the movie Rudy, right? I don't know if you remember this movie Rudy from the middle 90s, I guess. And it's this.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that.
Some feel-good story about a kid who makes the Notre Dame football team. And at one point, Rudy, the college kid, is talking to a priest. And the priest has this sort of definitive line. He says, Rudy, there's two things in this world that I know to be absolutely true. There is a God, and you're not him. And then it sort of inspires Rudy to, live his life free without having to worry about it. And there's this notion that comes from that where people talk about this all the time. They quote Bible verses from Numbers 23:19. God is not like a man that he should make a promise and not fulfill it, or that he should lie. Or they'll quote phrases out of Jeremiah that God doesn't change like a person changes. And so there's this kind of narrative within the folk religion of Christianity, and I think even some other faiths, that are like, okay, there's humans, and they kind of do their free thing. And then there's God, and God just is established and isn't anything like people. So when you say stuff that sounds like, hey, people live free, your grandson or you or a friend is making choices and living beauty in the world and creating and making and being a part of the process, there's people that go, yeah, but that's what people do. Almost by definition, that's not what God does. How do you think about those
That's
ideas?
a very interesting point. And where I guess I would come down here, Doug, is that a God who isn't free, who can't in some ways relate to us, is really a God we can't have a personal relationship with. I remember growing up, and my mother had this kitchen magnet, prayer changes things.
Yes.
Almost as if to say, when we pray, something new happens in the world.
Mm-hmm.
If God's already determined it, we don't need to pray.
Mm-hmm.
If God's already determined that the world's going to end on a particular day, we don't need to work for justice. We don't need to, in many ways, worry about global climate change. And I think where I'm going to say is that God's character as loving, which is, I think, the primary relational character of God, never changes. But if we know anything about love beyond what we can imagine, or even the own love in our own households, the way we love is always changing.
Mm.
And I think a God who doesn't change is frankly less personal than we are.
Mm-hmm.
God has to live with a world that God imagined before time, seeing it over and over and over again, and seeing the Holocaust, seeing a tornado, seeing somebody brutalized, or seeing joyful experiences with no sense of novelty. I think the best kind of God is the God who is ceaselessly loving, adapting, calling us, responding to us, inviting us to be the best kind of people in a personal thing, relationship as we can. I grew up in evangelical roots, so I believe that we have a personal relationship with God. You can't have a personal relationship with someone who doesn't change.
Huh, interesting.
Just go ask the marriage counselors. You have a personal relationship with someone who knows you intimately, who responds when you are in a certain mood or when you're going through a tough time, who's faithful, who's caring, who's loving, but whose power is seen as loving, not determining. Now, I think that's a big deal.
Now, what do you do when people say, well, look, a good parent is loving, or a good spouse or a brother or sister or a stranger is loving when they provide the structure that the otherwise random, living person can't get for themselves? So shouldn't God be the one who provides all of the structure so we can run around within it, but that we don't want God changing as God? Like, you know what I'm getting at? So people who would say, like, boy, that freaks me out, that there's nothing stable. How would God ever fulfill the promises if God can't coerce or force or make something happen? Isn't God just really giving us good intentions rather than real promises?
Well, I think the promise is the relationship. The promise is, I'm with you always. The promise is, I love you and you're engraved on the palm of my hand. The promise is, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And the promise is, I'm going to grow with you. I'm going to follow you, a little bit like the song, I was here to hear your mourning cry. That I'm going to be with you on each one of those, and I'm going to surprise you with possibility and energy and challenge. And the sort of God I'm imagining can't ensure that every story is going to end out right. But the God who can't necessarily guarantee that is not going to abandon anyone, and there really is no end of the story. You know, Rob Bell recently wrote a book. You've written books that have the same message, by the way, and so have I, saying that love wins.
Yeah.
And love wins means that love doesn't give up. The problem with these gods that determine everything is they give up. They quit loving you the moment you die. You know, I love you till the moment of your death. That doesn't seem like a very faithful God to me.
Well, that's interesting, and this is what I like about the way some of you are talking about this in new, fresh ways, is to try to say, look, you want to be faithful to the story of the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition, where a lot of people are like, look, I had to totally give up all this Christianity business because I couldn't handle that kind of storyline anymore. It didn't seem to make any sense to me. And you're not someone who's arguing, this is what I find fascinating about it, that like, yeah, me too. I had to give up on all that Christian stuff, so I've gone over and made up this other deal over here. You're actually saying from the beginning, from the time we're introduced to the story, God is an actor that wants human beings to take on responsibility in partnership with God in the world. And that seems. Can you stick around for another segment? Are you? Do you have time for another 15 minutes? Because I want to.
I think I can.
Good, fantastic. Because I got to be here anyway, so it's nice to have somebody along. You know, I think it would be great to sort of tease that out a little bit. And I'm encouraged. I'm trying to encourage you to make an argument that what you're suggesting is connected to the Christian story and isn't somehow some clever workaround of like smart, theologians that want to create another set of conversations and kind of do a sleight of hand for people. Because I know what you've been saying and what I've been saying to other people. I really do listen to the criticisms that people have of it, and I think there's some significant ones that folks like us need to be willing to address and to answer. So if you're okay, we'll come back here after the break and we'll talk about this. Now, folks, if you're interested in keeping up on this book and you want to get it, go to the Doug Pagitt Radio page on Facebook, facebook.com/Doug Pagitt Radio. And there's a link to the book, and you can get it there. And you could probably even friend Bruce on Facebook. He might even be good enough to accept your friend request. So head over there and do that and join in the conversation. And that way we'll be back here with Bruce Epperly, author of the book Process Theology, A Guide for the Perplexed, on Doug Pagitt Radio, religious radio that's not quite right.
It may seem like it's still a ways away, but the Stephanie Miller Sexy Liberal Tour will be here before you know it. Join us June 18th at the State Theater for what will undoubtedly be a memorable night with the whole Stephanie Miller crew, John Fugelsang, Hal Sparks, and Stephanie Miller herself. But you don't have all day because